On 1st February of every year, the finance minister presents the budget. So the way it works is a bit like this. 31st January, there may be, a few dozen economists in India. 1st February, India wakes up to crores of economists. Everybody and their uncle have become economic experts. 2nd Feb, we are again back to normal. No one cares anymore about the budget until the same time next year. And so if you are one of those people who want to really understand what on earth the finance minister will be going on and on about for 2.5 hours, what to make of that tsunami of data and opinions that crash onto you on budget day, what are the things to look out for as the finance minister speaks, what is the underlying story behind all this hype? Well, this video is for you. Hello and welcome to The Bond Economist, your one-stop destination for professional advice on the economy. My name is Oradeep Nandi, and in this video, we'll be covering three things. First, very simply, why is it that the budget matters? When people say, oh, the fiscal deficit is going up or down, what's the big deal about it? Two, what's the context? What's the background that you need for making sense of all these budget numbers? And three, what's the politics of it all? For all the hype that the budget generates, it's actually a pretty drab thing. It's essentially a detailed account of what the government spends versus what it earns. Whatever is the difference, the fiscal deficit, roughly speaking, is what the government has to borrow. Well, not technically, there has to be some adjustments, but broadly, fiscal deficit determines the extent to which the government borrows every year from the bond market. Why is this important? Well, first, in the bond market, the government is like a huge shark. It's at the top of the food chain. It is the largest borrower. It borrows by issuing bonds that are purchased by banks and financial institutions. So what happens when the government issues too many bonds, that is, borrows too much? Well, the supply of bonds in the market increases. And like anything in economics, when supply increases and there isn't enough demand, well, the price of bonds fall. And price and interest rates move in opposite directions. So interest rates start to rise, making it more expensive for consumers, banks, and corporates to borrow from the market, which in turn eventually hits investment. In economics, this is called the crowding out effect. So higher fiscal deficits generally tend to lead to higher interest rates in the market. Second problem, whatever you are borrowing every year essentially gets added to India's national debt. India's debt had shot up to close to 90% of GDP when the pandemic hit. It has since come down to a little over 80% of GDP. But the concern is that if India does not trim down its fiscal deficit to sustainable levels, well, the IMF's worst case scenario is for India's debt to reach 100% of GDP. I mean, yes, there are countries that are at higher levels than this, but it'll just become an additional headache for India. And three, higher fiscal deficit could lead to higher inflation. See, the more a government is spending more than it's earning, say if the government takes a helicopter and sprays cash all over the country, sure, it would boost growth. And you might think that's a good thing. But growth that is only reliant on government spending is a bit like living on steroids. Sure, if you're very weak, the doctor might give steroids to revive you. But if you keep relying on steroids to live, well, then you will have side effects. And in the case of the economy, that side effect is higher inflation. When you overstimulate the economy through out of control government spending, you risk creating more demand chasing lesser goods, which is a perfect recipe for inflation. Hence, higher fiscal deficit is a bit like too much of a good thing. So the general focus is generally to ensure that fiscal deficit is brought down to a sustainably low level, and then you can increase fiscal deficit when you have an economic crisis. So at one point, India used to aim for fiscal deficit at around 3% of GDP as the sustainable run rate. Currently, the government is aiming for that to be 4.5% of GDP in the next couple of years. And just to give you a flavor of how tough that's going to be, India is currently at close to 6% of GDP. So, how good has India been with fiscal discipline? Well, India's relationship with fiscal discipline is a bit like my relationship with fried food. I know it's bad, but it's too tasty to resist. India has had a long history of being very good in announcing expensive schemes and subsidies, but really bad at controlling it later. People keep saying, oh look, at UPA time growth was so much better. What they tend to forget is that the government was also spending indiscriminately. Actually, let me correct that. During UPA 1, India was actually being quite responsible on the fiscal front. Fiscal deficit was brought down. But then came the 2008 financial crisis, and general elections were close, and the central government opened all the taps. Farm loan waivers, higher food subsidies. You can see how India's central government fiscal deficit zoomed from less than 3% of GDP to as high as 6.6% of GDP. And look, economy is slowing down, you're ramping up spending, that's great. But when that objective is achieved and growth is stabilized, you also need to control spending and withdraw that stimulus and bring down the deficit. And the Congress government was really dragging its feet on that front. So at one point, India was left with high fiscal deficit, high inflation, high current account deficit, low growth, and high interest rates. No wonder India became part of what was known then as the Fragile Five. Now, the Modi government has arguably done a much better job. They started cutting down fiscal deficit, increasing investment spend, improving the targeting of government programs. So the Jan Dhan mission was all about, let's give you a bank account so that when I, the central government, I'm sending you 1 rupees, that whole 1 rupee should reach you directly in your bank account, not 50 paise being eaten up by the administration on the way. Things were going fine and fiscal deficit was coming down, but then the pandemic struck. And like most countries, India had to spend a lot to help the economy. So India's fiscal deficit zoomed up from around 3.4% of GDP to over 9%. But two things. First, this was actually much lesser than what most countries spent during the pandemic and are now having to live with the side effects of those steroids. And two, the Modi government took this opportunity to undertake a major fiscal reform. See, Indian governments traditionally do a lot of window dressing on the budget. So basically, a government agency like, say, Food Corporation of India would borrow instead of the central government. And so it won't officially reflect on the budget. The unofficial numbers would be hidden under some kind of footnote. So in market circles, India's actual fiscal deficit was always considered to be higher than what the official number is. So in the pandemic, the Modi government was like, let's clean up the balance sheet. Let's make it transparent. If a government agency is borrowing on my behalf, let that show up in higher fiscal deficit, which was a brilliant move. Basically, their point was that if we are indeed having to raise our fiscal deficit because of the pandemic, might as well let it increase a bit more, but at least we'll be able to achieve transparency. Now, since the pandemic, the government has been doing what the UPA government failed to do, bring down fiscal deficit. From 9.2% of GDP in FY21, fiscal deficit was slashed to around 6.6% of GDP in the next 2 years to below 6% of GDP in FY24, the current year. So the first question that economists and markets will be looking for in the finance minister's address on 1st February is whether the government is indeed looking to achieve this target. Per se, it shouldn't be a big problem. See, fiscal deficit is not just spending, it's also what the government gets through taxation, dividends from public sector banks and the RBI, disinvestments, and luckily for the government, this year saw stellar levels of income tax and corporate tax collections, also known as direct taxes. To give you a sense of how good it has been, so every year direct taxes typically grow a bit higher than the rate at which the economy is growing, which is also known as nominal GDP growth. So suppose the economy is growing by 10%. In a normal year, direct taxes typically grow by around 11%. This year, for every 10% growth in GDP, direct taxes are growing by around 24% or so. So the government has enough money for this year. Question is, what happens next year? So this is going to be a big part of the FM speech. What is the fiscal deficit target for FY25? Now, remember, we are at 5.9% of GDP now. Government's own plans is 4.5% of GDP within 2 years. Now, this is not easy. You can't go, sort of soft 1 year and then in the final year cut everything dramatically. A big part of government spending are on sticky items like wages of government servants, subsidies on food, fertilizers, interest payment on government's debt, defense spending, pensions, allocations to run various ministries. These are a part of what we call revenue expenditure, the regular day-to-day spending of which is required to run the country. And these are very difficult to cut suddenly. So if they are serious about 5.9% of GDP fiscal deficit going down to 4.5% of GDP in 2 years, well, that means that for next year, the finance minister has to announce a sharp cut. Markets seem to expect that fiscal deficit will be cut to 5.3 to 5.4% of GDP, but let's see. But these are all numbers. At the end of the day, the budget is also a long advertisement of the government to the public. So how do we analyze the politics of the budget? So technically, the budget on 1st February is going to be an interim budget, which means that because we are getting into Lok Sabha elections in possibly April to May this year, this budget is only there to run the government until around July, when the new government will step in and present the actual budget. So governments are typically constrained from announcing any major policy changes in the interim budget. That said, this budget may not really be interim in practice. One, because if opinion polls are to be believed, the BJP is likely to be back in power. So it would be kind of awkward for them if they didn't want to live up to the promises that they made just a few months back. Also, even though it's an interim budget, they will take this opportunity to address voters one last time in an official capacity before the model code of conduct kicks in, which is when the election commission announces the election dates. So it is a not so interim budget. Now, the BJP's priority in the general elections is Gyan, so Garib or poor, youth, Annadata or farmers, and N for Nari or women. So while the FM will most likely give a long list of announcements, watch out for what they dole out to these 4 key constituents: poor, youth, farmers, and women. News leaks suggest that the government intends to keep food and fertilizer subsidies at an elevated level, ensure that farmers who are now given 6,000 rupees per year as part of PM Kisan get 8,000 rupees per year, and in fact some reports are saying that women farmers may end up getting double the current amount, so 12,000 rupees. Things like affordable housing, health insurance for the poor, increased crop insurance should be on the cards. There's also a lot of focus on income taxes in the budget. While they may not want to announce major policy changes, income tax deductions are typically a very popular thing for the government to tweak to show that the middle class is also on their minds. And finally, watch out for what they're doing on investments. Now, I've said this before on The Bond Economist, this government has cut down on operational or revenue expenditure and ramped up infrastructure spending, money to build roads, bridges, railways, ports, etc. You can see for yourself how dramatically the Modi government had brought down subsidies of food and fertilizers for most of its term before the pandemic led them to reverse gears. Now, simultaneously, you can also see how central government investment spend, that blue bar, has been heading up steadily. And by the way, at a time when private investments are yet to pick up comprehensively, much of India's growth currently depends on this government spending on investment. The key question is whether they'll be able to keep up this momentum in an election year. For more such insights, like, share, and subscribe to The Bond Economist.